The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. I remember checking my watch as my director wrapped up what he called my performance review, though it felt more like a professional execution. He'd spent most of those minutes explaining how the department needed people with stronger technical skills, people who could really drive innovation forward. I sat there nodding, watching him gesture toward a stack of papers that I assumed detailed my supposed shortcomings. While behind him through his office window, I could see the server room where my code had been running their entire customer management system for the past 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me, not even slightly. See, when someone tells you that you lack technical skills while sitting in a building where 80% of the critical systems are running on code you wrote, you have a choice. You can argue, you can get defensive, you can demand recognition, or you can do what I did. You can smile, thank them for their feedback, and start planning. I'd seen this coming for months, really. The new management structure, the fresh faces from the consulting firm, the sudden emphasis on what they called modernization. They'd brought in Marcus Chen as the new technical lead, someone with an impressive resume and a tendency to speak in buzzwords that made the C-suite comfortable. Marcus had spent his first 2 weeks conducting what he called a technical audit, reviewing all our systems and processes. I found it interesting that his audit never actually involved talking to me about the systems I'd built. He'd requested documentation, which I provided. He'd asked for system diagrams, which I created. But he never once asked me to walk him through the architecture, never inquired about the design decisions, never showed curiosity about why certain things were built the way they were. That should have been my first hint. The second hint came during the department meeting where Marcus presented his findings. He'd created a beautiful PowerPoint presentation filled with colorful charts and technical terminology that sounded impressive to people who didn't understand what any of it meant. According to his analysis, our systems were legacy, our architecture was outdated, and our development practices were substandard. I listened to him describe the customer management system as a monolithic application with poor scalability, built using deprecated frameworks and lacking proper documentation. The same system that had processed over 2 million customer interactions without a single critical failure in the past year. The same system that had handled our Black Friday traffic surge without breaking a sweat while our competitors' websites crashed under the load. Marcus recommended a complete rebuild using microservices architecture, modern frameworks, and what he called industry best practices. The timeline he proposed was ambitious: 6 months to completely replace what he called the legacy systems, with significant cost savings through improved efficiency and reduced maintenance overhead. The executives loved it. They saw dollar signs and the promise of cutting-edge technology that would make them competitive in the modern marketplace. They approved the project immediately and assigned Marcus to lead the technical transformation. And that's when I realized they had no idea what they were actually running on. The customer management system wasn't just some application I'd thrown together. It was the result of 3 years of careful evolution, built to handle the specific quirks and requirements of our business that no off-the-shelf solution could accommodate. It integrated with 17 different third-party services, each with its own API peculiarities and failure modes. It handled the complex pricing logic that our sales team had developed over decades, including the grandfather clauses and special contract terms that affected nearly 30% of our revenue. More importantly, it was stable. In an industry where downtime costs thousands of dollars per minute, stability isn't just a nice feature, it's everything. But Marcus didn't see any of that. He saw code that didn't match the latest trends, architecture that didn't align with what he'd learned in his previous roles, and patterns that didn't fit the textbook examples he was comfortable with. During the weeks that followed, I watched him bring in contractors to assess the rebuild. I watched them quote timelines and costs that made me wince. I watched executives nod approvingly at presentations that completely misunderstood the fundamental requirements of our business. And I watched my role slowly disappear. The first indication was when they stopped inviting me to the technical planning meetings. Then they reassigned my other projects to team members who would be working under Marcus's direction. Finally, they scheduled that performance review where my director delivered the news with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked the fact that they'd already decided my fate. I didn't argue during that meeting. I didn't defend my work or point out the inconsistencies in their assessment. I simply listened, asked a few clarifying questions about the transition timeline, and confirmed the details of my departure. What I didn't mention was that I'd been preparing for this conversation for 2 months. You see, when you've built critical systems for a company, you develop certain habits. You document things, but you also understand that documentation only tells part of the story. You create backups, but you also know that backups don't capture the institutional knowledge about why certain decisions were made. You follow best practices, but you also know that every system has its own personality, its own quirks, its own ways of failing that aren't obvious from the outside. I'd spent those 2 months doing something that any responsible developer does when they see change coming. I'd been organizing my knowledge, creating detailed runbooks, documenting the undocumented procedures, writing explanations for all the decisions that seemed obvious to me, but might not be obvious to someone else. I'd also been paying very close attention to my access credentials. See, in most companies, access management is handled by the IT department, but they usually don't understand the technical nuances of what developers actually need to do their jobs. So they tend to rely on the developers themselves to request the appropriate permissions, and they rarely audit those permissions unless there's a specific security concern. Over 3 years of building and maintaining systems, I'd accumulated quite a collection of credentials. Database admin access for the customer management system, API keys for the third-party integrations, secure shell access to the production servers, administrative privileges for the monitoring systems, service account passwords for the automated processes. Most developers in my position would have a similar collection. It's not unusual and it's not malicious. It's just how things work when you're responsible for keeping systems running. What was unusual was how carefully I documented exactly what those credentials controlled and what would happen if they were suddenly unavailable. The day after my performance review, I submitted my formal resignation. 2 weeks notice, professional tone, expressing gratitude for the opportunities I'd had. I offered to spend my remaining time creating transition documentation and helping train whoever would be taking over my responsibilities. My director seemed relieved that I was being so cooperative about the whole thing. He accepted my resignation immediately and asked me to work with Marcus to ensure a smooth handover. Marcus, for his part, seemed confident that the transition would be straightforward. After all, according to his assessment, the systems I'd built were simple legacy applications that any competent developer could understand quickly. He'd already identified several junior developers who could handle the maintenance work until the new systems were ready. I spent my first week of notice creating the most comprehensive documentation I'd ever written. System architectures, database schemas, API integrations, deployment procedures, monitoring configurations, troubleshooting guides. I created flowcharts showing how data moved through the systems, dependency maps showing how different components relied on each other, and detailed explanations of the business logic that wasn't immediately obvious from the code. I also created a separate document that I didn't share with anyone. A detailed inventory of every system, service, and process that relied on credentials that were uniquely tied to my accounts. The list was longer than I'd expected. The customer management system used a service account that was created under my login. The database backups ran under a scheduled task that used my credentials. The API integrations with our payment processor and shipping partners were configured with keys that had been generated using my developer account. The monitoring system sent alerts to email addresses that were managed through my administrator access. Each of these dependencies had seemed logical when they were created. I was the person responsible for these systems, so it made sense that they would be associated with my accounts. But over time, as the systems grew and evolved, these individual dependencies had woven themselves into a fabric that was more complex than anyone realized. During my second week of notice, I started mentioning these dependencies to Marcus and the other team members who would be taking over. Not all at once and not in a way that seemed alarming, just casual observations during handover meetings. I mentioned that the database backup process might need attention after I left, since it was configured to use my credentials for the file storage system. I noted that several of the API integrations would need new keys generated, since the current ones were tied to my developer account. I pointed out that the monitoring system was configured to send alerts to my email address, and someone would need to update those settings. Marcus assured me that his team would handle all of these details. After all, updating credentials and configuration settings was basic system administration work. Nothing complicated about it. I offered to help them make these changes before I left, but Marcus declined. He preferred to have his team handle the transition work so they could get familiar with the systems. It would be good learning experience for them. I understood his reasoning. It made perfect sense from a management perspective. On my last day, I went through the standard departure procedures. I returned my company laptop and my building access card. I confirmed that all my project files had been transferred to the appropriate team members. I sat through an exit interview where HR asked me about my experience with the company and whether I had any suggestions for improvement. I didn't mention that I'd spent the previous evening at home, logged into the company's various systems one final time, systematically changing the passwords on every account that belonged to me. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't revenge. It was simply following basic security protocols. When an employee leaves a company, their access credentials should be immediately revoked. That's Security 101, the kind of policy that any competent IT department enforces automatically. The fact that our IT department's automated procedures only covered the obvious access points, the main network login, the email account, the VPN access, wasn't really my problem. They'd never asked me to document all the various service accounts and API credentials that had accumulated over the years, and I'd never volunteered to create that inventory. So I did what any security-conscious professional would do. I changed the passwords on my accounts to prevent unauthorized access, and I didn't share the new passwords with anyone. After all, I no longer work there. The first phone call came on Tuesday morning, 3 days after my departure. I was sitting in a coffee shop working on my resume and browsing job listings when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my former director's number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was professional but concerned. They were experiencing some issues with the customer management system, and they wondered if I might be available for a brief consultation call to help them resolve a technical problem. I finished my coffee before listening to the message again. Then I deleted it. The second call came that afternoon, this time from Marcus. His voicemail was more detailed. They discovered that several system processes weren't working properly, and they suspected it might be related to some configuration changes that had occurred around the time of my departure. He was hoping I could provide some quick guidance to help them get things back on track. I was in the middle of a job interview when that call came, so I didn't even see it until later that evening. By then, there were 3 more voicemails waiting. The tone of the messages was evolving. The initial requests for consultation were becoming more urgent. The third message mentioned that they were having trouble accessing the database backup system. The fourth message explained that several customer service representatives were unable to process orders because the system kept throwing authentication errors. The fifth message, which came in just after 9 p.m., was from my former director again. This time he mentioned that they were willing to pay consulting fees for my assistance with what he called a temporary technical issue. I have to admit, I was curious about what exactly was happening, but not curious enough to return their calls. Wednesday brought a new level of urgency. The first call came at 6:30 a.m. before I was even fully awake. It was Marcus, and he sounded stressed. According to his message, they'd been working all night trying to restore functionality to several critical systems, but they were encountering authentication failures across multiple platforms. The morning news brought some context to their desperation. I saw a brief mention on the local business news website that our former company was experiencing technical difficulties that were affecting customer service operations. The article mentioned that customers were unable to access their online accounts and that phone support was experiencing extended wait times due to system issues. By noon, I'd received 8 more calls. The messages were becoming increasingly frantic. Someone mentioned that the payment processing system had gone down, preventing new orders from being completed. Another message referenced problems with the shipping integration that were preventing existing orders from being fulfilled. The final message of the day came from the CEO himself. I recognized his voice from the company all-hands meetings I'd attended over the years. He was calling personally to request my assistance with what he described as a critical business emergency. He mentioned that they were prepared to offer significant compensation for immediate consulting support to help resolve their technical crisis. I didn't return that call either. Thursday morning, I woke up to find that our former company was trending on social media, though not in a good way. Customers were posting screenshots of error messages, complaining about orders that hadn't shipped, sharing stories about customer service representatives who couldn't access account information. The company's social media team was working overtime, posting updates about temporary technical difficulties and apologizing for the inconvenience. They kept saying that their technical team was working around the clock to resolve the issues and that normal service would be restored soon. But I could read between the lines. The specific nature of the problems they were describing, authentication failures, database access issues, integration problems with third-party services, painted a clear picture of what was really happening. They discovered that their systems were more dependent on my credentials than anyone had realized. And now that those credentials were no longer available, They were finding out just how many critical processes had been quietly relying on access that they'd never properly documented or transferred. The irony was almost poetic. Marcus had spent weeks explaining to the executives how simple and straightforward my systems were, how any competent developer could maintain them, how the technical debt I'd supposedly created was holding the company back. Now they were discovering that those supposedly simple systems were running their entire business. And without the proper credentials, even the most competent developers couldn't access them. By Thursday afternoon, the local business news had picked up the story. The headline read, "Local e-commerce company struggles with extended technical outage." The article mentioned that the company's website had been partially non-functional for several days, affecting thousands of customers and potentially impacting quarterly revenue. The article included a quote from a company spokesperson explaining that they were dealing with an unexpected technical challenge related to a recent personnel transition, but that they expected to have everything resolved within the next 24 hours. I wondered if they actually believed that timeline, or if they were just buying time while they figured out how to rebuild access to their own systems. Friday brought a different kind of call. This time it wasn't from my former colleagues, but from a recruiter who'd seen my resume online. She represented a company that was looking for someone with exactly my background and experience. They were particularly interested in candidates who had experience building and maintaining large-scale customer management systems. The conversation went well. Very well, actually. They were offering a 30% salary increase, better benefits, and what sounded like a much more collaborative work environment. They wanted to schedule an in-person interview for the following week. While I was on that call, my phone buzzed with another incoming call from my former company. I let it go to voicemail and continued discussing the new opportunity. The voicemail, when I finally listened to it, was from the company's head of HR. She explained that they'd been trying to reach me regarding what she called an urgent matter involving system access credentials. She mentioned that they were prepared to discuss bringing me back as a contractor at a significantly higher rate than my previous salary, with the understanding that this would be a temporary arrangement to help them through their current technical challenges. She also mentioned that they'd spoken with their legal team about the situation and that they wanted to have a conversation about what she called the proper procedures for credential management during employee transitions. That last part made me smile. After 3 years of building their systems, after being told that I lacked technical skills, after being replaced by someone who didn't understand what I'd actually built, they were suddenly interested in discussing proper procedures. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday morning working in my garden, enjoying the first truly relaxing morning I'd had in months. No emergency alerts from monitoring systems, no urgent requests to fix production issues, no pressure to deliver features on impossible timelines. It was peaceful. Sunday evening, I decided to check the company's website out of curiosity. The main page loaded, but slowly. Several of the product categories showed temporarily unavailable messages. The customer account login page displayed an error message about system maintenance. I checked their social media accounts and found a stream of increasingly frustrated customer complaints. People were asking about delayed orders, missing shipments, and inability to access their account information. The company's responses had become more generic over time, with customer service representatives clearly working from a script that didn't actually address the underlying problems. Monday morning brought a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was a lawyer representing my former company. He was professional but direct. He explained that the company was experiencing technical difficulties that appeared to be related to access credentials that had been modified after my departure. He wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss what he called the situation. I told him I'd need to think about it and asked him to email me the details of what he was proposing. The email arrived an hour later. It was carefully worded, but the basic message was clear. They believed I had information that could help them resolve their technical problems, and they wanted to discuss the terms under which I might provide that assistance. The email also mentioned that they'd retained a forensic IT consulting firm to investigate what had happened to their systems, and that they were documenting the timeline of events for potential legal action. I forwarded the email to a lawyer I knew who specialized in employment law and asked her to review it. Her response was immediate and reassuring. I hadn't done anything wrong. Changing my personal account passwords after leaving a company was not only legal, it was considered a best practice for information security. She also pointed out that if the company's systems were dependent on individual employee credentials in a way that caused business interruption when those employees left, That represented a fundamental failure of their IT governance, not any wrongdoing on my part. Tuesday brought news that the situation was getting worse. The business news reported that the company's technical outage had now lasted over a week, with customers increasingly vocal about their frustration on social media. Several major business customers had reportedly threatened to cancel their contracts if service wasn't restored soon. The article included quotes from industry analysts who suggested that the extended outage demonstrated serious problems with the company's technical infrastructure and business continuity planning. One analyst was quoted as saying that any well-managed technology company should be able to recover from the departure of a single employee without experiencing this kind of extended service disruption. That quote made me laugh out loud. A single employee, if only they knew. Wednesday morning, I had my in-person interview with the new company. It went exceptionally well. They were impressed with my experience, particularly my track record of building reliable systems that could handle high-volume operations. They offered me the position on the spot, with a start date of the following Monday. The salary was 40% higher than what I'd been making. The benefits package was excellent, but most importantly, they demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that made it clear they understood the value of experienced developers. During the interview, I mentioned in passing that I'd recently left a position where management had decided to rebuild their entire technical infrastructure. The interviewer, who was the CTO, shook his head sympathetically. He'd seen too many companies make that mistake, he said. Throwing away working systems in favor of the latest trends was a classic example of technology for technology's sake, rather than technology for business value. I accepted the offer immediately. That afternoon, I received another call from my former company's lawyer. This time, he had a concrete proposal. They were willing to pay me a consulting fee of $200 per hour to help them restore access to their systems. The contract would be for a maximum of 40 hours, and it would include a liability waiver protecting me from any claims related to the current technical difficulties. I told him I'd consider it and get back to him. But I'd already made my decision. I had a new job starting Monday, and I had no interest in helping my former employer fix problems that were fundamentally the result of their own poor planning and technical mismanagement. Thursday brought the most interesting development yet. I received a call from Marcus, my former director's technical replacement, but this wasn't a voicemail. He was calling from a different number, and when I answered, I found myself talking to him directly for the first time since I'd left. His tone was completely different from the confident, buzzword-filled presentations he'd given during my final weeks at the company. He sounded tired, frustrated, and more than a little desperate. He explained that they'd been working around the clock for over a week trying to restore functionality to the systems I'd built. They'd brought in contractors, consultants, and specialists from the vendors who supplied some of the third-party integrations, but they were still missing critical pieces of the puzzle. The problem, he admitted, was that the systems were more complex than he'd initially understood. The documentation I'd provided was helpful, but it didn't capture all the nuances of how everything worked together. There were dependencies and integration points that weren't obvious from the code or the architecture diagrams. More importantly, they discovered that many of the system credentials had been tied to my accounts in ways that weren't documented anywhere. The database backups, the API integrations, the monitoring systems, the automated processes, all of them were failing because they couldn't authenticate using the credentials that were no longer available. He asked if I would be willing to help them, even for just a few hours, to help them understand how to properly restore access to their own systems. I listened to his entire explanation without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I understood his situation, but that I'd moved on to a new position and wouldn't be available for consulting work. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he asked if there was anything, any amount of money, any terms, any arrangement that would convince me to reconsider. I told him no, but I wished him luck with the restoration project. Friday morning, I woke up to find that the story had been picked up by the National Business News. The headline read, "Small Business Learns Hard Lesson About Technical Dependencies." The article used my former company as a case study in what happens when businesses don't properly manage their technical infrastructure and employee transitions. The article quoted several IT security experts who emphasized the importance of regular access audits, proper credential management, and business continuity planning. One expert specifically mentioned that depending on individual employee accounts for critical business processes was a fundamental violation of basic IT governance principles. The article also mentioned that the company's stock price had dropped by 12% over the past week as investors reacted to concerns about the extended service outage and its potential impact on customer retention and quarterly revenue. I felt a small twinge of sympathy for my former colleagues who were probably working around the clock trying to fix the situation, but only a small one. The following Monday, I started my new job. The onboarding process was thorough and professional. They provided me with proper access credentials that were managed by their IT department. They had documentation standards, code review processes, and backup procedures that ensured no single person could create the kind of dependencies that had caused problems at my previous company. Most importantly, they treated technical expertise as valuable. When I explained some of the architectural decisions I'd made in previous roles, they asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in learning from my experience. When I suggested improvements to their existing processes, they listened and implemented the ones that made sense. It was a refreshing change. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally checked the news to see how my former company was handling their technical crisis. The updates became less frequent as the story moved out of the immediate news cycle, but I could piece together what was happening from their social media posts and customer service announcements. It took them nearly a month to fully restore functionality to all their systems. Based on the timeline of their updates, I could tell that they'd essentially had to rebuild significant portions of their infrastructure from scratch. They'd hired an expensive consulting firm to reverse engineer the systems I'd built, recreate the database access procedures, and reconfigure all the third-party integrations. The final cost, according to a brief mention in the business news, was estimated at over $400,000 in consulting fees, lost revenue, and customer retention efforts. The company also announced that they were implementing new IT governance procedures to prevent similar issues in the future. Marcus, I noticed, was no longer listed as the technical lead on the company's website. 3 months after I'd started my new job, I received an unexpected email. It was from my former director, the one who delivered my performance review about lacking technical skills. The subject line was simply, "Professional reference request." The email was brief and professional. He explained that the company was hiring for a senior technical position, and one of the candidates had listed me as a reference from my previous role. He was reaching out to ask if I'd be willing to provide a reference for my own work and contributions during my time there. I stared at that email for a long time. The candidate in question was someone I'd worked with briefly during my final months at the company. A talented developer who'd been smart enough to recognize that the technical transformation project was headed for disaster, and who'd apparently decided to find opportunities elsewhere rather than go down with the ship. In my reference call with the hiring manager, I spoke highly of the candidate's technical abilities and professional judgment. I also mentioned in passing that they demonstrated excellent instincts about technical risk management and business continuity planning. The hiring manager asked me a few questions about the work environment at my former company. I kept my responses professional and factual, but I did mention that there had been some challenges with technical leadership and infrastructure management during my final months there. He seemed to understand what I was really saying. 6 months later, I ran into my former director at a professional conference. The interaction was awkward but civil. He asked how I was enjoying my new role, and I told him it was going well. He mentioned that his company had successfully completed their technical modernization project and that their new systems were performing well. I congratulated him on the successful project completion. He paused for a moment, then said something that surprised me. He admitted that the transition had been more challenging than they'd anticipated, and that they'd learned some valuable lessons about technical dependency management and employee knowledge transfer. He also said, somewhat quietly, that they'd come to realize that my contributions to the company had been more significant than they'd initially understood. I thanked him for saying that and told him I appreciated the acknowledgement. But I didn't tell him that I'd already known my contributions were significant. I'd known it when I was building those systems, I'd known it when I was maintaining them, and I'd definitely known it when I was sitting in his office listening to him explain that I lacked technical skills. The difference was that now finally they knew it too. A year later, I was promoted to senior technical architect at my new company. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and expanded responsibilities for technical strategy and system design. During the promotion announcement, my manager specifically mentioned my track record of building reliable, maintainable systems that could operate at scale without requiring constant intervention. He also mentioned my expertise in technical risk management and business continuity planning. As I was cleaning out my desk to move to my new office, I found a printout of that original email from my former company's lawyer, the one asking me to help them resolve their technical crisis. I'd kept it as a reminder. though I wasn't entirely sure what I was trying to remember. Looking at it now, I think I understood. It was a reminder that technical expertise isn't just about writing code or understanding systems. It's about understanding the business value of what you're building, the risks of what you're changing, and the consequences of what you're leaving behind. It's about recognizing that when someone tells you that you lack technical skills while sitting in a building powered by your code, they're not really talking about your skills. They're talking about their own understanding. And sometimes the best response isn't to argue or defend or explain. Sometimes the best response is to let them find out for themselves. I threw the email in the recycling bin and moved to my new office. Through the window, I could see the server room where my new systems were running, processing thousands of transactions per day, supporting the business operations that generated millions of dollars in revenue. These systems were properly documented, properly managed, and properly integrated into the company's IT governance framework. When I eventually moved on to other opportunities, they wouldn't collapse because they weren't dependent on any single person's credentials or knowledge. That's what good technical architecture looks like. It's built to last, built to scale, and built to survive the people who created it. But it's also built by people who understand the difference between building technology and building a business. People who recognize that the most sophisticated code in the world is worthless if it doesn't solve real problems for real people. People who know that technical skills aren't just about knowing the latest frameworks or following the newest trends. They're about understanding systems, managing complexity, and creating value that lasts. The kind of skills that, once you really understand them, become pretty hard to ignore. Even when people try,